They stood trial for murder.
The cold-bloodedness was perhaps the most disturbing aspect to me.
I never dreamed I would be found guilty because I didn't have Norman killed.
And were sentenced to death.
I didn't want to be electrocuted. That was a pretty hard thing to swallow. But slow death is worse.
This program will take you behind the razor wire, bringing you the testimonies of women on death row.
I don't know whose idea it was to go in the back. One of the guys handed me a gun. I took it.
Each of them reveals what it's like to face execution and the consequences of their crimes.
A specialist counted 250 different injuries on that little one's body.
The state has called me a monster and all that. That is not who I am, and that's the whole purpose of me doing this interview.
I've never wanted to die.
I lost everything I ever cared about. Everything. Almost like every day is your last.
I want to stay alive for me. Because if I'm going to die in here, I'm going to die for my truth.
On March 8, 1991, Dr. Larzalier reopened his office after the lunch break. He was there along with a dental assistant and his wife, Virginia Larzalier, who worked as an office manager. While they were all at the dental office, a masked gunman came into the office.
Norman heard a noise. He proceeded towards the noise, and when he realized the masked gunman was in the room, he started running.
I hear running. I don't think anything. I hear running. And then there's a shot. I can see Norm, and he's just doing a 360, and he falls down.
The masked gunman fled the scene in broad daylight. Virginia Larzalier dialed 911.
911, what's the emergency? What's the problem, ma'am?
Somebody just came here and shot my husband!
Somebody what?
Somebody just came here and shot my husband!
But the shotgun blast proved to be fatal for the dentist who had run a successful practice in Edgewater, Florida.
Originally, the murder of Dr. Larzalier appeared to be some type of robbery gone bad. There were bottles of Valium and monies that were missing from the office immediately afterward, and not too much information about who this masked gunman could be.
Virginia Larzalier and her 18-year-old son Jason soon became prime suspects.
The state had the theory that Virginia used Jason to kill Norman Larzalier for insurance monies.
They discovered a whole trail of insurance policies that Virginia had taken out against Dr. Larzalier, worth about $2 million, policies that she would be the benefactor from if and when Dr. Larzalier had died.
The case remains an intriguing and complex story of adultery, greed, and murder. Virginia would face the death penalty, but after 17 years, there are some who believe that she stands wrongly accused. Until now, legal appeals have stopped Dr. Norman Larzalier's widow from speaking out.
I've been silent for a lot of years. I think it's time that I talked. Anything bad that can be said has already been said. So it's time for the truth to come out. I have 3 sisters, so I grew up in a house, 4 girls. My mom made 5. So by the age of 5, it was a daily routine of cleaning the house and watching after the sisters. I never really had a childhood.
According to Virginia, by the mid-1950s, the family from Lake Wales in Florida was harboring a dark secret.
My dad was a pedophile. There's no easy way or there's no hard way to even describe it. It started when I was 3 years old. I tried to take the blunt so that he would leave my sisters alone. I went to my mother one time and I tried to talk to her and she didn't listen. She just brushed it off.
My mother was molested as a child all the way until she moved out of the house. From very early on, I was aware of what her dad had done because he had molested me as well as a child. So I was very aware of what she had gone through because I had that sense of fear whenever we would go anywhere near him.
Virginia's life changed when she was still at school and she met Harry Mathis, a serviceman.
I married him before I even graduated high school, probably to get away from the house. As soon as I married Harry, it was a power tool. It was freedom. No one could tell me what to do. I'm a married woman.
In 1972, Virginia gave birth to a son, Jason. But by the time her daughter, Jessica, arrived a few years later, her marriage to Harry was in serious trouble.
Harry had a horrible temper, and he also had a horrible jealous streak. So if I went to the store, I was to be back in 5 minutes. If I went anywhere, I was to call. And he had a right, because I wasn't faithful, so he had a right to be jealous.
On the night of the 21st of April 1975, an unidentified man took 4 shots at Harry Mathis when he stopped to help a stranded motorist. Harry would later tell a reporter at the Orlando Sentinel that he thought Virginia was behind the shooting, but no charges were ever filed. Not long after, the couple split up.
So I was 24 when we broke up, and I was a single mom. I went to work in the phosphate mines as a maintenance.
There were more brushes with the law. Virginia was caught embezzling thousands of dollars from several of her employers and relatives. But Virginia's manipulative nature went beyond business. On a stormy night in 1982, she encountered a Florida state trooper.
It was raining, and I did a donut and hit another car, and I met James Matheny. He gave me a ticket. He called me that night to ask me out. We went out. We got married a couple weeks later, and as soon as the ticket was removed from my license, we got a divorce. I was just using him so that I didn't have a ticket on my driver's license.
Then Virginia met Dr. Norman Lazalier, a likable young dentist.
I was working at a construction job site in New Smyrna Beach and broke a tooth. Norman had just opened a practice in a strip mall on the Causeway. He worked on my tooth, and 4 hours later I was still in the office and we were still talking. He came over that night and had dinner and came over every day after that.
Well, the first time I met my dad, my mom told me that we were going to the dentist. And I wasn't very excited about that at all. And I walked into the dental office and I was met by this tall, bigger built man who had a furry caterpillar on his lip, just a big furry mustache, and he was the nicest and gentlest man I had ever met.
For the first time in my life, I had a best friend. We could talk about anything, we could share anything. We had no secrets. I told him all about my childhood, he told me about his.
One thing stood in their way. Norman was married. He eventually divorced his wife and wed Virginia in a civil ceremony in June 1985.
4 months after they got married, my father decided that he wanted to make us Larzalier children, and he adopted myself and my older brother Jason. And when he did that, he truly was our father.
The couple made their home in DeLand, Florida, and even had 2 children of their own, Benjamin and David. Although Virginia had finally settled into what appeared to be a happy and stable marriage, like many women who have suffered sexual abuse, she couldn't seem to remain faithful.
You always feel like it was your fault. You always feel like you have to please men no matter what they want you to do. So instead of being the prim and proper virgin of the South, I was very promiscuous. So the first one was with a gentleman, his name was Norman Karn.
The first time I met Virginia, she was kind of eyeballing me in the office. She was acting very flirtatious when I met her.
She was very promiscuous, always looking for love. the attention that she felt was void in her life. She received love, or what her version of love was, through sex.
According to Kahn, things took a dangerous turn when Virginia made him a deadly proposition.
I remember the time that Virginia first mentioned to me about killing Norman, and I didn't want to play. I took a note at that point and put in great big quotation marks, "She wants me to kill him."
When Women on Death Row continues.
Do I believe that Virginia had something to do in her husband's demise? Absolutely.
And later.
This woman was savagely beaten. She was choked. When the knife was pulled, she was still desperately fighting for her life.
And I try to wash all this blood off me, and it's not coming off.
It was maybe 1 o'clock in the afternoon, and it was just like any day there in the dental office.
The day of the murder, a masked gunman came into the office and was wielding a shotgun and chasing Dr. Norman Lazalier through the office.
I hear running, but I don't think anything. I hear running. And then there's a shot, and I can see Norm doing a 360, and he falls down.
A masked gunman came into the dental office and basically ended up shooting Dr. Norman Lazalier. Dr. Lazalier was hit in the chest. The shotgun blast went through a door.
And there's a guy, and he's got this small shotgun in his arm, and he raises the shotgun, and it comes right at me, but it doesn't fire. So I grab the arm with the shotgun, then he slings me off, and he slings me backwards.
The masked gunman ended up going out a side door and getting into a car and leaving the scene.
What's the problem, ma'am?
Somebody just came here and shot my husband!
Somebody what?
Somebody just came here and shot my husband!
I go over to him. He's actually talking. He asked me, "Where's Jason?" He asked me, "Where's Jessica?" He asked where Benjamin was. I asked him if he can breathe, and he says, "Sure."
But by the time paramedics had arrived, Dr. Norman Lazalier was taking his last breath. The unidentified gunman had made off with the contents of a safe, which had contained cash, gold coins, and Valium. At first, it appeared to be a robbery gone awry.
Virginia gets a detailed description of the assailant by height, weight, skin coloration, footwear, pants, and identifies the type of weapon he was carrying.
Virginia Lazalier described someone who was shorter and had a bigger build.
Another eyewitness gave a very different description of the gunman.
The dental assistant for Dr. Lazalier testified that she saw a gunman who was tall and slender and was similar to Jason Lazalier, who was Dr. Lazalier's adopted son.
Emma Lombardi testified that she thought she recognized Jason Lazalier's physical form. And she said it was approximately the same height, the same body build.
That wasn't the only mention of Jason.
Dr. Lazalier had just been wounded, and he made a comment, "Where are you, Jason?"
Emma Lombardo testified that Virginia Lazalier had gone over into the room from which the shot came and said out loud, "Is that you, Jason?"
So he was mentioned twice in the moments after the shooting, even though he didn't work there and under regular pretense. He wasn't there.
Investigators began questioning those who knew the Lazalier family. Edgewater police tracked down 22-year-old Kristen Palmieri, who worked for Dr. Lazalier as a secretary and was often a guest at the Lazalier home. During a tape-recorded interview, The police noticed that Kristen was clearly hiding something.
What I want from you is I want the truth, because I've got you in lies.
What lies?
You told me that you were not involved in this.
I wasn't.
There's two avenues that you can choose. The avenue that goes this way, which is with us, or you have the avenue which is going to go be where Virginia and Jason end up.
The young secretary, who claims to be afraid of Virginia, began to provide the police with some incriminating details.
We were sitting at the table, and Jason and Virginia were arguing. Virginia had turned to Jason and said, "Don't worry, you'll get your $200,000." Jason had said that he wanted to go and turn himself in because he was tired of the investigation and the lies and everything. He wanted to turn himself in, and Virginia had said to him, "Fine, then go tell your brothers and go tell your sister and everybody." And she told him that she wouldn't give him any money and he was on his own. That's what he wanted to do.
The police uncovered a second key witness, 20-year-old Stephen Heidel.
Stephen Heidel was Jason's friend. He would run errands for him, pick up his dry cleaning, and was compensated by the Lazaliers for that. Stephen Heidel testified that following the shooting, that's when he became involved in at least the cover-up.
Heidel said that he was also manipulated by Virginia, who ordered him to dispose of 2 guns.
Steve Heidel told police that Virginia Larzalier told him to take the guns, wipe off the fingerprints, encase them in concrete, and dump them off a bridge into a creek.
Stephen Heidel's account of Virginia's plot to get rid of the guns was backed up by Kristen Palmieri.
Stephen came downstairs and he had some kind of long thing with cement in it. And she said to just go take that and get rid of it. Him and I went for a long drive. I remember driving all the way up to St. Augustine. Finally, he stopped somewhere on a bridge and told me that he was going to get out and make believe like there was a flat tire and for me to dump it over the side.
This police video shows a diver recovering the guns encased in cement from a creek.
Steve Heidel was the one that showed police where they were, and they were able to retrieve that and find the guns inside there.
They got it?
But they were never able to conclusively determine that these were the guns that killed Dr. Larzalier.
In exchange for their testimony, Kristen Palmieri and Stephen Heidel were granted immunity. The police then charged Virginia and Jason with first-degree murder. Virginia was arrested in May 1991. Jason surrendered the next day. Virginia's trial began in February of the following year.
We had drug, sex, and rock and roll in this case, and if you would have listened to the police, we had voodoo. The state had the theory that Virginia used Jason to kill Norman Larzalier for insurance monies. They alleged that she had extramarital affairs. Rather than to divorce Norman, she simply wanted to kill him and then live off the insurance proceeds, which she was going to share with Jason Larzalier.
Prosecutors brought in many witnesses who testified that Virginia clearly wanted her husband dead.
She tried too hard to get me to do it. And I know of one other guy that she worked at trying to get to do it. And she was darn determined to have him killed. Do I believe that Virginia had something to do in her husband's demise? Absolutely. Absolutely.
That was the testimony given by different people who were solicited by her to murder her husband. Jason Larzalier was a young man under the control of a very strong-willed mother. She had made a serious effort to recruit others to murder her husband. Going to her son seemed to be the last straw.
But the defense maintained that although Virginia had made some mistakes, she did not kill her husband.
I think the jury probably took a very dim view of Virginia's character. They heard all of this extraneous testimony and evidence about her affairs, and they probably didn't like her very much. But that's a far cry from being a murderer.
The star witnesses for the prosecution were Kristen Palmieri and Stephen Heidel.
Stephen Heidel had real problems with credibility because he claimed not to know anything about this shooting prior to the actual shooting itself. He participated greatly in the cover-up, including the disposal of the actual murder weapon, according to his testimony.
I once had a prosecutor who told me that you can't pick your witnesses, and if they are just unsavory characters to begin with, then they're just unsavory characters to a murder case. And that seemed to be the case in the Virginia Larzalier trial. Steve Heidel and Kristen Palmieri had kind of checkered pasts, weren't very stable, kind of living at the Larzaliers. They were the ones who heard all these incriminating statements.
But the jury found their testimony credible enough to convict Virginia Larzalier of the murder of her husband.
The cold-bloodedness was perhaps the most disturbing aspect to me. This was not a crime of passion. This was a crime of money. I have no doubt in my mind that she is guilty.
You knew Stephen Heidel was lying. You knew Kristen was lying. I never dreamed I would be found guilty because I didn't have Norman killed. I had nothing to do with his death.
Not long after his mother's conviction, Jason Larzalier went on trial. But unlike the jury in Virginia's trial, jurors felt the evidence against Jason was not strong enough for a conviction.
Jason Larzalier was tried after his mother's trial, and ironically, he was acquitted of being the triggerman. So there was never anyone convicted of actually shooting Dr. Larzalier.
So what this case basically is you have a murder mystery. You have a masked gunman coming into a dental office and shooting Dr. Norman Larzalier. We do not know who that shooter is.
Despite the fact that the gunman was never identified, Virginia Larzalier was sentenced to death for her role in the murder of her husband. She appealed, and her sentence was overturned. In 2008, she was resentenced to life and will be eligible for parole in the year 2016. Virginia Larzalier is still fighting to clear her name.
I was convicted based on my reputation. I was promiscuous. If I saw something, I went after it. I was self-centered, and I did what I wanted to do, when I wanted to do it, and how I wanted to do it. So I was easily convicted.
Virginia believes that the answer lies with Kristen Palmieri and Stephen Heidel, whose testimony helped send her to death row. As for her daughter Jessica, she once believed that her mother was guilty, but now says that she is innocent.
I want to speak out now about my mother's innocence because the more I seem to think about all the facts and the more I put everything together, the more it makes sense. Not only does justice need to be served, it's been 17 years, and the person who shot my dad, they need to pay for killing my father. You never stop missing a loved one. It's my dad.
I miss him every day. I would rather it had been me instead of Norm, because he didn't have the reputation I had, and he would have kept our family together.
As I had the phone up talking to the loan officer, I looked and noticed that two people were walking in the door, and I saw a gun, and I said, oh my God, the bank's being robbed.
At 10 a.m. on the 2nd of September 1975, 22-year-old Faye Brown and her friend 21-year-old Joseph Seaborn stormed into the Branch Bank and Trust Company in the rural town of Jamesville, North Carolina. With their weapons drawn, Joseph and Faye approached the cashier.
I was scared to death that she was going to shoot somebody, and she just pointed the gun, and I just backed up.
I asked her to open the drawers, and I took the money out and I put it in my purse.
I went and laid on the floor, and then they got Ruth to lay on the floor, and then another person in the bank. I was really a little scared with the gun in front of me.
Faye and Joseph fled the scene with $6,000 in cash. They jumped into a getaway car driven by another friend, Frankie Squire.
When I walked out the bank, I got in the front seat of the car and I just laid down and I went to sleep.
15 minutes later, the group was pulled over by Highway Patrolman Trooper Tom Davis for allegedly running a red light.
Joseph Seaborn was laying in the back seat of the vehicle, laying down, possibly on the floor of the vehicle. And Faye Brown was laying down in the front passenger seat. So Trooper Davis could only see one person.
According to court documents, Trooper Davis approached the car, and then suddenly Joseph Seaborn fired his sawn-off shotgun from the back seat. The blast struck Davis in the neck.
When I got over to Tom, Tom was still alive. There was just so much blood you couldn't see anything but the hole. There's just so much blood coming out of it. He had a hole in his chest big enough you could put both hands in.
Davis was rushed to the hospital, but soon after died from loss of blood. The suspects sped off and abandoned their car in a nearby cemetery. A manhunt of over 100 police officers scoured the area for them. 4.5 hours later, they found Faye Brown, Frankie Squire and Joseph Seaborn when a patrol helicopter hovered over a soybean field and revealed their hiding place.
I was afraid. Two of them grabbed me and twisted my arms behind my back and was, I'm sorry. I'm sorry.
Faye and her co-defendants were charged with murder and armed robbery. If convicted, the 22-year-old faced the gas chamber.
I was guilty of going in the bank. I know I was guilty of that. I was wrong for being there in the first place. Indirectly, maybe I bear some responsibility for his death, but not directly. You know, I never meant for anybody to be hurt. No, never.
Faye Brown was born in 1953 near the small town of Garysburg, North Carolina.
My mother and father had 8 kids together, and my dad, he had 2 other children. So we were not rich. We were a poor family.
Times were tough for the close-knit family of 12. Segregation and racial strife between whites and blacks ruled the South. Money was also tight. Her father worked in a sawmill and her mother at a sewing factory.
We had good parents who instilled in us the good things in life. We always had food, clothes, shelter.
All our parents wanted us to do was to go to school, you know, and get an education because they didn't have a chance to get an education.
As a sister, Faye was very smart and she was very opinionated. You know, she would go to school, she would do her work, and she always made straight A's, and she never had to study.
I really liked school. And as a matter of fact, when I graduated from the 8th grade, I was the valedictorian.
But everything changed when Faye's parents insisted that she attend a desegregated school 30 miles away.
We were assigned to a predominantly white school. They had Klan signs up and down the highway, and the kids didn't want us to sit beside them on the bus, and it was just a lot of racial tension.
My mother, she always felt like she wanted us to have the best. They were telling them at that time that this was the best thing for Faye. But Faye, of course, didn't feel that way.
We used to have shakedowns at the school like it was a prison. So a lot of times I got expelled, you know, because I was very outspoken.
Faye's rebellious streak continued at home, where she repeatedly defied her parents.
Sometimes they would whoop her, and she wouldn't cry. And I would cry because it hurt me, you know, to see her getting a whooping. Because she wasn't a bad person. When she got in her head that she was right about something, you know, that's just the way she was.
At about 16, Faye says she became fed up and dropped out of school. She turned to drugs to escape her mounting frustration.
When I quit school, I didn't do anything but just, you know, hang around with older people and get high, smoke marijuana, drink, and that's it.
They called the police, and they told her to just let her sit in jail overnight. and, you know, see if that would scare her back into shape.
There were never any charges against me, you know, and then they would come and get me, thinking that I would act better or do the things that I was supposed to do, but I didn't.
But her parents still had high hopes for their daughter.
My family had my life all planned out for me. They decided that I was going to finish school, I was going to go to college, and I was going to get a good job. They decided that for me. And I just refused to go along with it.
Faye briefly went back to school, but left before graduation. Over the next couple of years, she continued doing drugs and hanging out with the wrong crowd. In 1973, she met two men at a club. They were Frankie Squire and Jason Seaborn. It would change the course of her life forever.
Frankie, I had been knowing maybe about 2 years. I didn't know Joseph that well. We used to just hang out, you know, and get high.
But according to Squire's testimony, the group did more than just drugs. Agent Slaughter says that in August 1975, Faye, Frankie and Joseph conspired to rob a local bank for some quick cash.
It was a planned act. They had been talking about robbing the bank for some period of time. That's not something that just happens that morning while you're drinking coffee.
Faye claims there was no such plan. On the 2nd of September 1975, she says that Joseph and Frankie picked her up to go for a ride.
I had been doing acid all night, and the following morning was when I saw them. I got into the car with them, and we were just riding and drinking beer and smoking marijuana. We got into this little town. I don't know whose idea it was to go in the bank. One of the guys handed me a gun. I don't know if it was loaded or whatever, but I took it and I put it in my purse. So when I walked into the bank, I just stood in line.
She had bleached her hair out, and she put a hood on her head. And she came around to the teller window and came behind the cage.
Joseph walked in. He's put the sawed-off shotgun together in front of my face. And I can just hear it clicking right now. It was a terrible sound.
He was a short little fella, but when he put the gun together, it clicked 3 times, and I thought, he's going to kill her, just as sure as the world. And then they told us all to lay down. If everybody would cooperate, if nobody would be hurt.
The 2 cashiers and the 1 customer lay on the floor while Faye removed $6,000 from the drawer.
She knew what she was doing, okay. I don't think she was scared.
Faye Brown and Joseph Seaborn fled the bank with Frankie Squire behind the wheel of the getaway car. Approximately 15 minutes later, North Carolina State Trooper Tom Davis pulled the vehicle over for a routine traffic offense. The authorities believe that Davis had no idea that the 3 had just robbed a bank.
The suspect's car real slowly came through the intersection and actually ran the red light. And my dad pulled in behind them. It appeared to be 1 person in the car.
He walked up to the car, and someone across the street in the garage said they heard him say, "Good morning." And about the time he said that, somebody rose up out of the back seat. A shotgun blast went off.
Next, on Women on Death Row.
If you run with a pack, you're responsible for the kill. That's a fact of law.
And also,
when I found out that Lisa was gay, I was a little mad. Well, I ain't gonna say a little mad, I was very mad.
Marcella and Lisa were isolated because they were homosexual. Things got further and further out of hand, and the further out of hand it got, before long it's out of your control.
In September 1975, 22-year-old Faye Brown and 2 friends robbed a bank in Jamesville, North Carolina. Soon after, Trooper Tom Davis pulled over the getaway car. As he approached the vehicle, he was shot in the neck by Joseph Seaborn from the back seat.
I knew Trooper Davis from playing against his son in Little League Baseball. He was a friend to everybody. Everybody knew of Tom Davis.
In 1975, Dan Whitehurst was a 19-year-old volunteer medic. He was visiting his father just 20 feet from the crime scene when he heard the shot.
I grew up hunting, so I knew it was a shotgun blast, it wasn't a rifle blast. When I got over to Tom, he had a hole in his chest big enough you could put both hands in. All I could do was, I had t-shirts on, I took my t-shirt off, I tried to put it in his chest, anything I could get a hold of to make a pressure bandage and put it on and try to stop the bleeding. And you know, Tom would open his eyes and look at me, and I feel like today that Tom knew who I was, but he just couldn't tell me anything.
Trooper Davis was rushed to the hospital, but the loss of blood was too great. He was 49 years old. Davis's son was on his way to school when he heard on the radio that a highway patrolman had been killed.
You know, it always runs through your mind that it might be my dad, but it always, you know, you say it's somebody else. The instructor called me outside, and then the two troopers told me that my dad had been shot and killed in a bank robbery. I mean, the death of my father was devastating. I lost one of my best friends and a mentor, and you know, the only thing we had left was memories.
He was such a strong part of this community, and then all of a sudden, someone to come in and say he's been killed is quite a shock.
While friends and family wrestled with Davis's death, Faye and her cohorts were on the run. They abandoned their car in a nearby cemetery and then took off on foot.
We walked to a soybean field, and I pulled my shoes off and I laid down and went back to sleep.
Over 100 officers were called in to track down the suspects.
It was one of the largest manhunts that they had ever seen.
State Highway Patrol helicopter joined the search and actually landed, and they blew the soybean down and revealed where the suspects were hiding.
I saw all those police coming through the field, then I got scared. Two of them grabbed me by my arms, and one of them hit me in the back and said, "I have to blow your damn head off."
When they came in, they looked like people who had been working in the field, but they did not look like anybody who had been beat up.
Investigators also recovered the shotgun, a pistol used in the robbery, and $6,000 in stolen money from Faye's handbag. The three were then taken into custody. Joseph Seaborn confessed to the shooting, but claimed it was an accident. According to Slaughter, this was impossible.
The likelihood of him shooting the door, the back seat, or the roof out were far better than striking a trooper. I do not believe it was an accident.
Faye Brown then gave her statement. Although she now claims that she was asleep, Agent McLeod says that's not what she told the police 33 years ago.
She did not say she was high, did not say she was asleep. She said that she was laying down in the front seat of the car and she heard the gunshot.
I just laid down and I went to sleep. I do not remember hearing a shot at all. I don't even remember the car stopping.
She sure wasn't asleep when she walked in that bank, and she wasn't asleep when she stuffed the money in the pocketbook.
Although the confessions and the evidence clearly pointed to Joseph Seaborn as the gunman, all three were charged with murder and armed robbery.
I was thinking, well, I can't be punished for that because I didn't do that. I can only be punished for what I did. And I admitted what I did, you know, because my parents didn't teach me to lie.
Someone is killed in the commission of a felony. If there's more than one person involved, they're all three guilty of murder.
It was bad enough that she had robbed a bank, but then we found out that somebody had lost their life because of it.
If you run with a pack, you're responsible for the kill. That's a fact of law. I'm sorry that she finds herself in this position, but I'm more sorry for the trooper.
The trial began in January 1976. Faye Brown, Frankie Squire, and Joseph Seaborn were tried together.
I was tried with them because the judge denied all the motions for change of venue and separate trials. they were not even talking about me, you know, even though I was there, because I wasn't included in it. And I just never believed that I was going to be convicted.
They had witnesses. There was actually a lady that was on her front porch where my dad got shot. When the car drove off, she looked directly at the driver's eyes and looked him in the face, and she ID'd him.
This case was just overpowering. The physical evidence was there. The confessions were challenged, but there was no real challenge to it.
I was numb. It was like it was happening to somebody else and not me. They made a mistake, you know, because I didn't kill anybody.
She was partially responsible for the death of a law enforcement officer. I think she needs to cope with that.
My reaction was a sense of closure. I wasn't jumping up and down with joy because it was a sad time. It was a sad time for everybody. I mean, it was a sad time for the three of them to know that they were facing the death penalty. It was a sad time for us because we'd lost our dad.
Faye was transferred to North Carolina's death row. She was only 22 years old.
A lot of times I could not even look myself in the mirror. I hated to even look at myself because I hurt a lot of people.
In 1976, in a twist of fate, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the sentencing terms of North Carolina murder cases were unconstitutional. Faye and her co-defendants were resentenced to life with the possibility of parole. Although she escaped death, Faye didn't feel she had much to live for.
I proceeded to do the same things that I did before I got locked up. I was still getting high in prison. I wasn't a model inmate. Not by a long shot, I was not. I was very angry, bitter. I was a young woman sent to prison, and I felt like I was there unjustifiable.
After a decade behind bars, Faye's attitude began to change. She began studying and trained as a beauty therapist. She was also reconciled with her parents. But in 1991, Faye's mother died of cancer.
I think after my mom died, I really got serious. That was the turning point. I stopped doing drugs. All my parents ever wanted me to do was to go to school and get an education.
That took a terrible toll on her. And I told Faye that even though Mama was gone, that I would do all I could to be there for her.
Faye Brown has lived in prison for 33 years. She has been denied parole 22 times due to the nature of her crime.
I do feel like she should have been punished for what she did. Everybody should. But, I mean, this is a long time, 32 years. She was only 22 years old when she went in. I feel like she needed that second chance to come out and see what she learned.
I believe that I should be out. I believe that I should have been out a long time ago. I mean, by me being here, I mean, what? I don't get it.
Bank robbery that led to my father's death is, you know, it's hard to put into words how I feel. I'm sorry that they did it. Do I think about them on a regular basis? No, I do not. But at the same time, when I do think about them, I think that they should serve their time.
Faye still claims that she was asleep when Trooper Davis was shot, but she does feel remorse for her part in his death.
I'd like to say to the family of Guy Thomas Davis Jr. that I am truly sorry for your loss. I didn't mean to hurt you. Never meant any harm to anyone. And I hope that someday that they will forgive me.
When Women on Death Row continues.
You know, we've got this frail elderly woman who's cut down in her kitchen. There was blood everywhere.
And I got the death penalty, and I paid for it dearly every single day of my life.
And later,
when a specialist looked at the photographs of Devontae, she counted at a minimum 250 different injuries on that little one's body.
In the autumn of 1985, the small, quiet town of Reddington Beach, Florida was horrified when a member of their community, 77-year-old Geneva Kane, was found brutally murdered in her home.
Well, it really was a shock to the community for an elderly woman to be home alone and to have the sanctity of her home breached and to have such a brutal, violent murder occur in this community.
On the 1st of October 1985, Mrs. Kane's neighbors called the police after noticing that her newspaper was still in her front garden and that her garage door was closed.
Normally, Mrs. Kane got up, got the newspaper, the garage door was open, so there were some peculiarities that had the neighbor concerned.
I was assigned to respond to a house out in Reddington Beach, Florida. Mrs. Kane was laying face down in her kitchen in a pool of blood. It appeared that her throat had been cut.
Listen, the crime was a big deal. You know, we've got this frail elderly woman who's cut down in her kitchen. There was blood everywhere.
The big question facing the homicide detective, Terry Rhodes, was who could have committed such a vicious act against a 77-year-old widow.
There was no sign of any forced entry into the house. The house did not appear to be ransacked. We immediately began interviewing neighbors, anyone that might have had some knowledge of our victim. As the evidence technicians were processing the scene, they found a small gold ring with a red ruby stone in it.
This small ruby ring would be a key piece of evidence. It would lead to the arrest of 22-year-old Casey Dudley for the first-degree murder of Geneva Kane.
I got the death penalty. I took it in flying colors. Somebody needed to take the rap. Well, I wish I could take it back. And I paid for it dearly every single day of my life. I relived it every day. Well, I was born in Columbus, Georgia, but I lived in Phoenix City, Alabama. I had a father that was pretty powerful. He was into the Ku Klux Klan. It was in the time of the movement in Alabama. So the little things that he did with his little secret societies was kind of like on the down low.
To the outside world, Casey's father seemed like a nice, normal family man. But in reality, she says, he was a monster who turned their home into a torture chamber.
Well, he was a happy-go-lucky type of guy when he was out and about socially. But behind closed doors, I went through a lot of physical and mental and emotional abuse, along with my mother and my sister. I was about 9 years old when I had to tell my mother that, you know, people don't live like this.
Casey had a terrible childhood. From what she told me, she and her sister both were abused. Their mother was abused. She was a battered woman.
I remember one time seeing there was an iron ladder. My mother was tied to it and beat. And we thought she was dead. I think I was probably about 4 years old. He always told me, you could try to tell people, they're not going to believe anything you have to say. So I basically accepted that.
Witnessing her mother suffering was too much for the young Casey. She began using drugs and alcohol to escape the pain.
I drank my first beer, probably, and bourbon by 6. I started using around 9, smoked marijuana, and then I graduated to acid, and did those kinds of things, Valiums, because that's what was laying around the house.
Casey still sought love and affection no matter what the price.
I did various things to get his attention, because he never really showed love. So I did do stupid things like hit myself in the nose to have a nosebleed, or I poured turpentine in my ears to have violent earaches.
Casey's parents divorced when she was a teenager. She bounced back and forth between her mother and father until one night when she said her father beat her for the last time.
He beat me pretty bad. I was black and blue from my shoulder blades down to probably the back side of my kneecaps.
The troubled teenager ran away and ended up in Georgia with her mother, but that environment wasn't any better.
She was very dysfunctional. She had married again. He was a pervert. I was trying to bring it to her awareness. And she basically said, well, you know, if you don't like the way things are running around here, you know where the door is.
She seemed to have had a very difficult upbringing, difficult life. Her mother was, in her words, an alcoholic. Casey, on several occasions, been left to fend for herself and make do.
Despite the instability, her mother was all she had in life.
Well, I know my father did a lot of damage, and I justified her behavior. She was an alcoholic. She's almost killed several times, and I was there to pick up the pieces.
But when her tumultuous home life became too much, Casey ran away again and made the streets her home.
I hit the road a lot, going out and putting myself into jeopardy.
In her early 20s, Casey left Georgia and tried to start a new life in Daytona Beach, Florida. There, she met a 38-year-old businessman called Bob Bennett.
He had a little money going, and of course he meant well. Probably the first person that ever did. And he just forbidded my mother to come around me.
But Casey's continued drug use put a strain on her only stable relationship.
I would take off on my little excursions and stay gone 3 or 5 days. He got to where he just didn't give me a rein of the car or money. So I had to end up getting a waitress job.
While working as a waitress, Casey began having an affair with a colleague, 19-year-old Michael Sorrentino.
He just looked real cute. He had this cute little sports car, you know, cocaine. He was into what was happening at the time. So we were seeing each other.
Casey's mother, Nancy Dean, was now living in Florida. She took a job about 3 hours away from Daytona, working for a wealthy 77-year-old widow called Geneva Kane.
Mrs. Kane obtained Mrs. Dean through an employment service in St. Petersburg.
Nancy Dean moved in as a full-time housekeeper, but tension soon started to develop between her and Geneva Kane.
Mrs. Kane, she was quite a feisty, very independent woman. Most people felt like that she was very demanding of the people that she hired. She wanted a lot of attention, a lot of help.
My mother would call me up periodically and say, you know, I can't believe what this woman's doing to me today and this kind of thing. You know, with my mother's alcohol problem, they began to fight a lot.
According to the authorities, Casey's mother hatched a plan to rob the widow.
Mrs. Kane was a woman who had some wealth. Nancy Dean simply saw an easy opportunity to make Mrs. Kane a victim and steal her belongings.
Well, I was like, why don't you just get some bikers together and just come over here and throw down, and you just take off for the whole house, and nobody gets hurt, of course.
Nothing ever came of the robbery idea, because after several more arguments, Geneva Kane fired Nancy Dean in September 1985.
We also believed at the time that Mrs. Dean may have been drinking outside the residence. Mrs. Kane apparently didn't tolerate alcohol.
After losing her job, Nancy Dean went to Daytona, where her 22-year-old daughter was there to pick up the pieces. Casey checked her mother into a motel. That night, Casey's new boyfriend, 19-year-old Michael Sorrentino, joined the two for a night of partying.
We all hung out there and got drunk, got high on cocaine, and my mother's just like, I just can't let this go. I got to go back to this place and get my belongings. I got to get this. I got to get my tax refund check. We got to go. We got to go back. I can't just leave it.
When Women on Death Row continues.
There was blood everywhere, and I couldn't control what was going on. It was happening so fast.
And later.
Tying up a child and putting him in a pantry is intentional, and it's cold-blooded, and it's evil.
By the summer of 1985, 22-year-old Casey Dudley was working as a waitress in Daytona Beach, Florida. She had a steady drug habit and a boyfriend, 19-year-old Michael Sorrentino. That September, Casey's mother, Nancy Dean, was fired from her job as housekeeper to a wealthy widow, Geneva Kane. Nancy looked to Casey for help. After a couple of nights of partying, it's believed that Nancy convinced Casey and Michael to rob Geneva Kane.
Nancy Dean told them that Mrs. Kane had very expensive jewelry, possibly some cash in the house, and that it would be very easy to take these rings and sell them for money.
On the 30th of September, Casey, her mother, and Michael drove the 3 hours to Mrs. Kane's home in order to steal her rings.
We all packed up in the car, you know, and Mike was driving, and everything was just real gung-ho. At the last minute, Mom's like, I don't know if I should go or not.
Nancy Dean didn't want to be at the scene, so she requested that they drop her off here at this intersection and that she would wait for them.
She sends her young daughter and her boyfriend in to do the dirty business. She was a prime player, just as guilty as anybody else.
Under the ruse of collecting her mother's things, Casey and Michael knocked on Geneva Kane's door at about 7 p.m.
This is the home of Geneva Kane. Mrs. Kane let them in after Dudley announced who they were and that she was there on behalf of her mother. Miss Kane fixed them something to eat, gave them something to drink.
They went into the home and spent about 2 hours talking with Mrs. Kane. They gained her confidence, they gained her trust.
What transpired next remains unclear. Casey claims that she attacked Mrs. Kane when the widow allegedly made an offensive remark about her mother.
The woman was very rude. She was downgrading my mother, but on the same token, she was very arrogant, you know, and called her a bitch.
Casey basically assaulted Mrs. Kane in an attempt to steal her rings and remove her rings off of her hands. A struggle ensued.
I took my belt off and put it around her neck and slung her to the floor.
Stop it! Stop it! Stop it!
Well, about this time, my co-defendant's behind me, and we're both strangling her at this point.
Oh my God!
Well, it finally came to mind what exactly I was doing.
Her statement to us was that she had run across the house to look out a window to see if anyone had heard Mrs. Kane screaming. She states when she returned to Mrs. Kane's body that Michael Sorrentino had used a knife and cut her throat.
He's come off the floor with a knife. Now, I have no idea exactly how he cut her throat.
But the authorities believed it was Casey who cut Mrs. Kane's throat.
This woman was savagely beaten. She was choked. When the knife was pulled, she was still desperately fighting for her life.
There was blood everywhere, and I couldn't control what was going on. It was happening so fast. I was losing my mind. So I go in the bathroom and I try to wash all this blood off me, and it's not coming off.
After haphazardly cleaning up, Casey and Michael stole Mrs. Kane's handbag and the ring from her lifeless finger. They then frantically returned to pick up Casey's mother.
And now my mother has convenient amnesia about anything, and she sees blood all over me, and she's wanting to ask questions of what's going on, and I have no answers other than throwing up all over the place. And so we go to a motel room, and I go in the shower. And my mother cleans up all the evidence.
According to Casey, Nancy Dean also disposed of the murder weapon. A few days later, Michael and Casey pawned the stolen ring for $3,000. Michael went to California, Casey took a bus to Atlanta.
All the investigators and the crime scene technicians realized what a horrific scene this was with anyone, but especially an elderly woman in her own home. There was a tremendous amount of blood.
While processing the gruesome scene, the detectives found a single ruby ring under Mrs. Kane's body. They then began questioning neighbors for any clues as to who could have wanted Mrs. Kane dead.
We had been alerted by a witness that Mrs. Kane had had a recent housekeeper, a live-in companion by the name of Nancy Dean.
Over the next month, the police interviewed Casey's mother twice, At first, she denied knowing anything about the murder.
When you came over here to Pinellas County to talk to Detective Rhodes, why didn't you tell him then what you know now?
I just couldn't.
Why?
She's my daughter, but she's involved in it, and I didn't want her to be involved in it. She's not a bad girl. I just couldn't understand how it happened or why it happened or anything. I noticed Casey had blood all over, and I thought she'd been hurt. And she admitted they had come to see Mrs. Kane. I asked her why, and she's still hysterical. She really couldn't talk. And she said not cut her throat.
In addition to her mother's confession, Casey's work colleagues positively identified the ruby ring as hers. The police widened the hunt for the killers.
We located the former boyfriend of Casey Dudley, Bob Bennett. Bennett had indicated to us that he had received word that she possibly had returned to Georgia, where she was from.
After 7 months on the run, Casey was apprehended by the police in Atlanta on the 8th of May 1986. Despite her claim that Michael had slashed Mrs. Kane's throat, she was charged with murder in the first degree.
I was totally up about 100 pounds when I was arrested. I basically was very abusive to myself. I shot drugs back to back. I wasn't eating. I was ready for the grave. So when I was arrested, I was actually relieved that I didn't have to look over my shoulder.
Casey's accomplice, Michael Sorrentino, was later arrested 3,000 miles away in Garden Grove, California.
We confronted him with the fact that Casey Dudley had given a statement indicating that he was the one who'd actually cut Mrs. Kane's throat. He denied that from the very beginning.
Casey's trial began in September 1986. Although the 23-year-old had no previous criminal record, she could face the electric chair if convicted.
The crime was committed during the course of a robbery. The crime was cold, calculated, and premeditated, and the crime was especially cruel, heinous, and atrocious.
I thought it was going to be a difficult case. Casey had had a hard life as a teenager. She was only 22 at the time. She had a hard look about her, and that, of course, concerned me. You know, you want sympathy and pity. And early on, I recognized that that was going to be a problem in this case.
There was other damning evidence. In addition to the ruby ring found at the crime scene and Michael Sorrentino's statement, experts found blood evidence from the getaway car. They claimed that the amount of blood where Casey was sitting suggested that she was the killer.
We had every reason to believe, based on the facts that we had, that she was the one who attacked Mrs. Kane. She was the one who choked Mrs. Kane.
That was probably almost a zero-chance case. It didn't matter whether she or Sorrentino killed Mrs. Kane, it was first-degree murder. That scenario is a prosecutor's dream.
The jury found Casey guilty and sentenced her to death. Like most of her life, Casey was more concerned about the woman who, the police say, put her up to the robbery.
I just was worried about how my mother was going to respond to it. So when they did pronounce, you know, you will die in an electric chair until you're dead, I turned around to look at my mother like, you know, everything's going to be all right, I'm okay, and my mother passed out.
I think it's always a very somber moment for anyone. But as a prosecutor, I felt that Mrs. Kane had received justice. And I agreed with their recommendation.
In 1989, Casey's death sentence was overturned on appeal. She was resentenced to 25 years to life.
I didn't want to be electrocuted. That was a pretty hard thing to swallow. But slow death is worse. To live daily and misery and betrayal and everything that goes with it. Nobody can make you do anything that's not in you to do. A lot of people use drugs for an excuse, child abuse for an excuse, but fact remains that you made that final decision.
By the age of 45, Casey had been in prison for 22 years. She has spent much of that time trying to rehabilitate her life. In 2003, she met fellow inmate Wendy Wilson.
Casey meant a lot to me. Casey really took me under her wing. She was just so soft-spoken, tender-hearted, and it just really surprised me that she could ever have been guilty of such a horrendous crime.
Casey now spends her time working in the infirmary and focusing on meditation.
Casey's trying to pay her debt to society by taking care of elderly people now, whereas the life of an elderly woman was taken in her crime. And she spent most of the time in prison doing just that, taking care of people that are ill, that are elderly.
I found much peace in meditation, my spirituality, what little bit you can find in a place like this. You have no rehabilitation plan in here. You have to rehabilitate yourself. I'm very sorry that I can't change anything, but I am doing my time.
Is he conscious? No, he's not breathing. Can you please get the fire?
In the early morning hours of the 26th of July 2004, Arlington police received an emergency call from the Arbors apartments.
Did you see what happened? No, I don't know. He got something coming through his nose.
The voice on the line was that of 23-year-old Marcella Williams, whose 9-year-old son Devontae had stopped breathing.
The day before, he was real sick and he was throwing up a lot. Everything that he ate and everything he drank, he was throwing up and it was coming out.
Although Devontae had been sick for days, Marcella had failed to seek medical attention. Also present was 28-year-old Lisa Coleman, Marcella's live-in girlfriend. By the time they called 911, it was too late.
I don't know what the baby was just laid there.
Unconscious person, Arbors of Arlington, 10.
Thought we'd find on arrival a standard 9-year-old boy, a workable patient, a salvageable patient. What we really found was an emaciated, looked like third world country 3-year-old. He's just completely opposite of what we expected.
It was obvious that this was not just a child that had quit breathing, that this child was severely malnourished. He had a disposable diaper on. The injuries were extremely obvious.
They tried to revive Devontae, were not successful. It quickly went into a criminal investigation.
The local media picked it up and ran it pretty heavily back then. This was a horrendous crime that this child essentially had been starved to death.
He was tied up. He was tortured. All child deaths are horrible when they're murdered, but this child lived a horrendous life up till the day he died.
Within hours of Devontae's death, Marcella and her girlfriend Lisa Coleman were arrested and charged with his murder. But prosecutors quickly identified Lisa as the main perpetrator. In the state of Texas, a crime of this magnitude carries the death penalty.
Well, people are going to think what they want to think anyway. But, I mean, they should know that you can't believe everything you hear and what the state has called me. A monster and all that, that is not who I am. And that's the whole purpose of me doing this interview. I grew up in Louisiana with my mom and my brothers and sisters. I really didn't just have a childhood life like normal kids.
For one thing, Patricia Coleman was just 13 years old when she gave birth to Lisa.
My mom, she was molested, well, raped, you know, and I was the product out of that rape.
And so Lisa was born as a result of a rape. And of course, her mother was only 13.
The alleged abuser was Patricia's own stepfather. To escape the abuse, Lisa's mother moved in with her grandparents.
Lisa's mother's trying to take care of her, and she's 13 or 14 years old, and so she's living with her grandparents, which still have 13 kids at home, and you know, they're just not able to manage all that. And so before long, Lisa's mother starts getting into trouble.
Real problems began when the young mother moved out of the overcrowded house into a flat of her own with Lisa and her infant son, Philip.
My mom, she was there, but not like a mother should be.
She started leaving Lisa, which was only 2.5, with her brother, which was 6 months old, in apartments alone without any clothes and any food, and they keep calling the police to come and get them. And so here's poor little Lisa. She's 2.5 years old trying to take care of a 6-month-old. They're locked in this apartment with no food.
I mean, by being young, I did some wrongs. I'm not perfect. When I was younger, and they ended up going to foster care, Lisa and my oldest son did, because I was out there boosting. I had to do something to take care of my kids.
Patricia wound up in prison for shoplifting. Lisa and Philip were put into foster care, where they spent the next few years.
Lisa got very attached to these foster parents. I mean, this was the first stable sort of home she'd had. And unfortunately, the Winstons' house burned down. Mrs. Winston apparently had some sort of nervous breakdown, and so she had to be hospitalized. And so Child Protective Services had to come and take Lisa and Philip and place them somewhere else. They reacted very badly, particularly Lisa, because she felt like she was being rejected once again, that nobody wants me.
Lisa and her brother ended up back in the care of their mother. According to Lisa, this is when the sexual abuse began.
Well, a lot was going on. I was being molested constantly by my uncle.
It's a pitiful background, actually. Very skewed as far as any relationships. Her being abused, beaten, her moved around from home to home in a foster setting as well as with other relatives. Her being not only physically abused but sexually abused in the past. She really didn't have a chance to escape from all of that.
When Lisa was 13, Patricia moved the family to Fort Worth, Texas. Chaos ruled Lisa's life.
I went to using drugs, smoking marijuana and drinking. And I was still in school, of course, but I was just going, but I wasn't getting anything out of it. And I started running with gangs and doing drugs.
When Lisa was 16, she discovered that she was pregnant. Like her mother, Lisa turned to hustling. She says she had to provide for her son, Dontrell. And starting in 1993, Lisa was arrested numerous times. Her criminal record includes selling drugs, burglary, and theft. While on parole, she met Marcella Williams.
She was one of the people that me and other friends hung around. And we just hooked up actually one night at the club. We, you know, chit-chatted, talked, whatever, and we started hanging out, and then we became real close.
We just decided that we would get serious. We started being with each other instead of other people.
But Lisa's mother did not approve.
Well, actually, when I found out that Lisa was gay, I was a little mad. Well, I ain't gonna say a little mad, I was very mad. But I never, ever agreed with that. Whatever she did, I couldn't say nothing to her. It was just, they was gonna be together. Lisa and Marcella was gonna be together.
Over the years, Lisa would serve more time in prison. By the year 2000, Lisa had left her son Dontrell in the custody of her mother and moved in with Marcella and Marcella's 3 children. Her daughters, Destiny and Alicia, and an older son called Devontae.
Lisa initially was the caretaker for the children. She's the one that fed them, clothed them. Lisa had a fairly good relationship with Devontae. They called him Tay-Tay, and she frequently referred to Tay-Tay.
Devontae was also a child with special needs. According to some accounts, at times he could be a handful.
When Devontae was born, he was very premature, only weighed a pound or so, and he was in the hospital for a lengthy period of time. Devontae had all sorts of learning disabilities. He was a problem in school, frequently getting called to come and get him.
The testimony from a teacher was that he was a delightful child, but that he had issues with boundaries, parameters. He had really not been taught social skills.
I mean, he was just a normal child, loving, just a normal child. I mean, kids are kids. Kids are going to get into stuff.
According to Marcella, Lisa would often resort to violence to keep Devontae in line.
I would ask her why, why you do the things you do, why, She wouldn't, he's hard-headed and he's the little boy and little boys need to be tough and little boys need to, not be no sissy or no punk.
Marcella and Lisa were isolated because they were homosexual, and so they weren't really accepted by the family. Things got further and further out of hand, and the further out of hand it got, before long it's out of your control.
At one point, the Child Protection Services intervened, and Marcella temporarily lost custody of her children.
Devontae was 5 or 6 when they were took, due to the fact of Devontae telling my worker that Lisa had whooped him hard with a extension cord. The plan was to reunite them with me on the conditions and concerns of not being around Lisa. When I got them back months later, I ended up getting back with Lisa. I mean, at first it was physical abuse, but then it got worse.
Coming up on Women on Death Row.
When I first saw Devontae, my first impression was wasting disease. And then it finally dawned on me exactly what it was. It was starvation.
I should have spoke out. I should have did something when it was all happening.
In late July 2004, 28-year-old Lisa Coleman was living in Arlington, Texas, with her 23-year-old girlfriend, Marcella Williams, Marcella's 2 young daughters, and 9-year-old son, Devontae. The couple were on the run.
They moved around from apartment to apartment, attempting to avoid Child Protective Services and police agencies.
Marcella had already lost custody of her children once, when Child Protection Services found signs of abuse. She regained custody, but on the condition that she stayed away from Lisa Coleman. But Lisa was still in her life, and the evidence suggests that the abuse had intensified. It's believed that to avoid detection, they pulled Devontae out of school.
It was obvious they were removing him from school, so there would not be any authority figures around to ask what was going on with this kiddo.
Devontae was a boy with special needs. He'd been prescribed Ritalin for hyperactivity. In addition, despite being small for his age, Devontae had an insatiable appetite.
I smelled something, I woke up, he was standing over the stove with his shirt, and I looked around, I said, Devontae, what are you doing? He was like cooking breakfast.
I never in my whole entire life seen a kid that small could eat a meal for you, him, and anybody else.
To prevent his late-night kitchen raids, both Marcella and Lisa confessed to tying Devontae up.
She described how she and Marcella would restrain Devontae to keep him from getting in trouble or to keep him away from dangerous things. They would maybe restrain him up to 4 or 5 hours at a time, every once in a while.
According to the prosecution, not only was Devontae physically restrained, but the boy was even locked in a pantry and routinely deprived of food.
Tying up a child at his wrist and his ankles and putting him in a pantry is intentional and it's cold-blooded and it's evil. Any 9-year-old child who gets hungry, if they are not being restrained, locked up, will find food. Whether it's from neighbors, whether it's in his own home, whether it's in a dumpster, they will find food. It's an instinct. Yes, tying up a child, leaving him in the pantry, and not feeding that child, that was intentional.
Then came the beatings. According to Marcella, it was Lisa who would often resort to violence.
It's a way to discipline a child and a way not to discipline a child. I used to always try to tell her, yet I didn't do more of what I should have done. You know, I was young and I didn't do more of what I should have done.
Marcella, she ain't never been nothing. She wasn't even a mother. To me, she wasn't. Lisa Ann Coleman, she played father to those kids. Lisa fed them, bathed them, went to the grocery store, make sure that they had this and they had that.
Lisa Coleman was the dominant figure in this relationship. Marcella was more of the passive figure. Concerning the abuse with Devontae, both of them were involved, but she seemed to be harsher and took the lead a lot in what happened to Devontae.
I should have spoke out. I should have did something when it was all happening.
When what was all happening?
Well, that's part of my case, and that will be going into my case, which I prefer not to discuss.
In late July 2004, 9-year-old Devontae Williams came down with severe flu-like symptoms.
I went and bought him medicine over the counter, Pedialyte for being dehydrated, chicken noodle soup, stuff like that, you know. And I was like, my plan was if he didn't get no better, whether he had bruises or not, because I was scared to take him to the hospital because I knew that they were going to take my kids.
According to Marcella, on the night of the 25th of July, she put Devontae to bed and woke later to find her 9-year-old son's lifeless body.
Did you see what happened? No, I don't know. He got something coming through his nose.
When I began to do CPR on him, the food and everything that I had gave him, he was throwing up. I was on the phone calling 911, asking what do I do, you know, get somebody out here.
I don't know what the baby just laid there.
Unconscious person, Auburn of Arlington, 1010 East Arkansas.
When I first saw Devontae, my first impression was wasting disease. And then it finally dawned on me exactly what it was. It was starvation, systematic starvation over a long period of time. I had seen it before in Sudan back in 1985.
When a specialist looked at the photographs of Devontae, she counted at a minimum 250 different injuries on that little one's body, including burns, massive ligature markings on his wrist and ankles. Devontae probably couldn't drink because he had a massive split lip. He had a trauma injury to one of his ears that was just massive. There wasn't a place on his body, there wasn't injuries.
The cause of death was pneumonia and malnutrition. 9-year-old Devontae weighed only 35 pounds, half the normal size for a boy of his age.
The prosecution essentially said that he was beaten or starved to death. We had our own expert to indicate, yes, he did suffer from a mild case of starvation, but it was nothing that was intentionally inflicted upon him.
Lisa Coleman and Marcella Williams were both charged with murder and kidnapping. Marcella pleaded guilty and so avoided a trial. Against Lisa, the prosecution sought the death penalty.
Ms. Coleman was charged and tried for capital murder, which in this particular case was murder that occurred during a kidnapping, keeping him tied up and away from food in the pantry.
In Texas, in order to be eligible for the death penalty, you have to have committed a murder plus some type of special circumstances. In this particular case, it was alleged that Lisa committed the murder while in the course of conducting a kidnapping. It was the state's position that Lisa and Marcelo restrained, therefore kidnapped Devontae by tying him up and keeping him from getting food. And frankly, that position is just ludicrous. And without the kidnapping, Lisa wouldn't be eligible for the death penalty because without the kidnapping, this would not be a capital murder.
I can still see her face real vividly last time I saw her. She was in the holdover. We talked about her sentence, and gives me nightmares. Oh, I just feel so bad for her. As I said, she didn't deserve it, but we have to move on. And, this is a tough business we're in, and it's tough to get acquainted with your clients in these situations and then try to forget about it. You really can't. You live with it every day, and especially with Lisa.
Well, first of all, yes, I do have a lot of regrets, but it doesn't say to where I'm guilty of this crime, because that is not it at all. But I regret that I didn't react sooner to what was happening like I should have.
Lisa told me that it's very painful for her to talk about it. She told me that she cared a great deal for Devontae, and whenever we talked about this, she was always tearful.
It's not a day that don't go by that I don't think about them. I made bad choices. I stayed in an abusive relationship around somebody that was abusing me and my kids. But I would never do nothing like that to my kids. I want her in prison for life without parole, to suffer. To me, death is the easy way out. Suffer.
I'm leaning and depending on you, Father, because you've been so good to all of us. Your goodness and your grace and your mercy have overcome it, and we just truly want to say thank you, Lord. Thank you. Touch Lisa's heart, Lord. Let her know that we love her, we care for her, Heavenly Father.
I don't think she deserved what she got. God gonna see her through. He'll see her through it. If it meant to be, he'll see her through it. I mean, only he know what happened between them and the baby. I don't know. But I still say my daughter don't deserve no death plus the life.
They stood trial for murder.
The cold-bloodedness was perhaps the most disturbing aspect to me.
I never dreamed I would be found guilty because I didn't have Norman killed.
And were sentenced to death.
I didn't want to be electrocuted. That was a pretty hard thing to swallow. But slow death is worse.
This program will take you behind the razor wire, bringing you the testimonies of women on death row.
I don't know whose idea it was to go in the back. One of the guys handed me a gun. I took it.
Each of them reveals what it's like to face execution and the consequences of their crimes.
A specialist counted 250 different injuries on that little one's body.
The state has called me a monster and all that. That is not who I am, and that's the whole purpose of me doing this interview.
I've never wanted to die.
I lost everything I ever cared about. Everything.
Almost like every day is your last.
I want to stay alive for me. Because if I'm going to die in here, I'm going to die for my truth.
On March 8, 1991, Dr. Lars Lear reopened his office after the lunch break. He was there along with a dental assistant and his wife, Virginia Lars Lear, who worked as an office manager. While they were all at the dental office, a masked gunman came into the office.
Norman heard a noise. He proceeded towards the noise, and when he realized a masked gunman was in the room, he started running.
I hear running. I don't think anything. I hear running. And then there's a shot. I can see Norm, and he's just doing a 360, and he falls down.
The masked gunman fled the scene in broad daylight. Virginia Lazalier dialed 911.
911, what's the emergency? What's the problem, ma'am? Somebody just came in and shot my husband! Somebody what? Somebody just came in and shot my husband!
But the shotgun blast proved to be fatal for the dentist who had run a successful practice in Edgewater, Florida.
Originally, the murder of Dr. Larzalier appeared to be some type of robbery gone bad. There were bottles of Valium and monies that were missing from the office immediately afterward, and not too much information about who this masked gunman could be.
Virginia Lazalier and her 18-year-old son Jason soon became prime suspects.
The state had the theory that Virginia used Jason to kill Norman Lazalier for insurance monies.
They discovered a whole trail of insurance policies that Virginia had taken out against Dr. Larzalier, worth about $2 million. Policies that she would be the benefactor from if and when Dr. Larzalier had died.
The case remains an intriguing and complex story of adultery, greed, and murder. Virginia would face the death penalty, but after 17 years, there are some who believe that she stands wrongly accused. Until now, legal appeals have stopped Dr. Norman Larzalier's widow from speaking out.
I've been silent for a lot of years. I think it's time that I talked. Anything bad that can be said has already been said. So it's time for the truth to come out. I have 3 sisters, so I grew up in a house, 4 girls. My mom made 5. So by the age of 5, it was a daily routine of cleaning the house and watching after the sisters. I never really had a childhood.
According to Virginia, by the mid-1950s, the family from Lake Wales in Florida was harboring a dark secret.
My dad was a pedophile. There's no easy way or there's no hard way to even describe it. It started when I was 3 years old. I tried to take the blunt so that he would leave my sisters alone. I went to my mother one time and I tried to talk to her, and she didn't listen. She just brushed it off.
My mother was molested as a child all the way until she moved out of the house. From very early on, I was aware of what her dad had done because he had molested me as well as a child. So I was very aware of what she had gone through because I had that sense of fear whenever we would go anywhere near him.
Virginia's life changed when she was still at school and she met Harry Mathis, a serviceman.
I married him before I even graduated high school, probably to get away from the house. As soon as I married Harry, it was a power tool. It was freedom. No one could tell me what to do. I'm a married woman.
In 1972, Virginia gave birth to a son, Jason. But by the time her daughter, Jessica, arrived a few years later, her marriage to Harry was in serious trouble.
Harry had a horrible temper, and he also had a horrible jealous streak. So if I went to the store, I was to be back in 5 minutes. If I went anywhere, I was to call. And he had a right, because I wasn't faithful, so he had a right to be jealous.
On the night of the 21st of April 1975, an unidentified man took 4 shots at Harry Mathis when he stopped to help a stranded motorist. Harry would later tell a reporter at the Orlando Sentinel that he thought Virginia was behind the shooting, but no charges were ever filed. Not long after, the couple split up.
So I was 24 when we broke up, and I was a single mom. I went to work in the phosphate mines as a maintenance.
There were more brushes with the law. Virginia was caught embezzling thousands of dollars from several of her employers and relatives. But Virginia's manipulative nature went beyond business. On a stormy night in 1982, she encountered a Florida state trooper.
It was raining, and I did a donut, and hit another car. And I met James Matheny. He gave me a ticket. He called me that night to ask me out. We went out. We got married a couple weeks later, and as soon as the ticket was removed from my license, we got a divorce. I was just using him so that I didn't have a ticket on my driver's license.
Then Virginia met Dr. Norman Lazalier, a likable young dentist.
I was working at a construction job site in New Smyrna Beach and broke a tooth. Norman had just opened a practice in a strip mall on the Causeway. He worked on my tooth, and 4 hours later I was still in the office and we were still talking. He came over that night and had dinner and came over every day after that.
Well, the first time I met my dad, my mom told me that we were going to the dentist. And I wasn't very excited about that at all. And I walked into the dental office and I was met by this tall, bigger built man who had a furry caterpillar on his lip, just a big furry mustache, and he was the nicest and gentlest man I had ever met.
For the first time in my life, I had a best friend. We could talk about anything, we could share anything. We had no secrets. I told him all about my childhood, he told me about his.